And everyone can hear me. Wonderful. Alrighty. Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for a riveting and insightful presentation that will highlight one of the greatest leaders in ancient human history, Cyrus the Great, whose egalitarian empire led to the world's first Declaration of Human Rights, the Cyrus Cylinder. Following our presentation, we will have a musical performance from prodigy Neil Nayar, so please stay tuned. We will then have a Q&A session, and we will end the presentation with a few announcements at the very end. A few housekeeping notes. If anyone has any technical issues, please post them in the chat. Also, after Neil's performance, like I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat as well. All right. So that's me. And just some more information about the UNA USA. The United Nations Association of the USA was founded by Eleanor Roosevelt, and our UNA USA Sacramento chapter has been dedicated to advocating for the continued support of the United Nations and all of its vital agencies over the last 70 years. Through the many challenges that our planet has faced, the UN has stood by as a symbol of international cooperation that is crucial to the promotion of human rights, protecting the environment, and advancing global health and well-being. With more than 200 chapters across the country and more than 20,000 members, the United Nations Association is the single biggest organization dedicated to supporting the UN and promoting the priorities behind its vital work. Also, I want to thank all of our partner organizations for co-sponsoring today's event. We wish to thank the United Nations Association Davis Chapter, the Unitarian Universalist Association of Sacramento Middle East Justice Group, Jewish Voice for Peace Sacramento, and California Green Academy. Thanks to our partner organizations, we were able to properly promote our event far and wide, and we reached so many more people than we otherwise would have. We are also streaming on Facebook Live as well, and we will be making this event available on our YouTube channel within 3 days' time. Moreover, I want to thank our amazingly talented musician, Neil Nayar, who graciously offered one of his musical performances for us all to see later during today's presentation. At 15 years old, Neil is an amazing musician, and we are lucky to have the opportunity to showcase his talents. Lastly, I want to thank our main speaker, Mr. Afshin Zand, whose passion, dedication, and knowledge of ancient history is both impressive and inspiring. Thank you, Mr. Zand, for your willingness to educate all of us about one of the most progressive leaders in ancient human history, Cyrus the Great. Now, on to some background information about Mr. Zand. Afshin Zand, scholar of cultural history, was a student and co-author of the late Richard Frye of Harvard University, known as Dean of the World's Iranologists. They have worked on this project regarding Cyrus the Great since 2008. Afshin and his family came to the US in 1975 on his father's sabbatical at Harvard Business School, where he was awarded an honorary MBA, and Afshin started his studies at MIT. After his bachelor's degree, Afshin studied cultural history for a few years. In 1984, he met Professor Richard Frye of Harvard University at a conference who invited him to undertake a course of studies. Ashin undertook these studies from 1985 to 1993 and remained in close collaboration in research and authorship with Richard Frye. Without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Afshin Zand. Take it away, Mr. Zand.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I thank everybody for being present. As some of you recall, on October 29th, which is the day of commemoration of Cyrus the Great and his freeing captives in Babylon, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued this announcement on his Twitter account that today in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great entered Babylon and freed the Jewish people from captivity. His respect for human rights and religious freedom inspired America's founding fathers. The US stands with the Iranian people, who are blocked by the regime from celebrating his legacy. Now, some of you may like Secretary Pompeo and some of you may dislike him. Scholarship does not take a position on that. It's a position of Secretary of State that is there, and individuals come in and fill it and then leave the post to others. So scholarship is neutral as to the personalities involved. We mention it because it came from the US Secretary of State, and now we will show the evidence for what he has said. Next slide, please. So the content of our presentation today consists of 4 main topics. The relevance and necessity of Cyrus the Great to our very present day. How Cyrus inspired America's founding fathers, as the Secretary said, just exactly how, and the documentary evidence from the notes of our founding fathers, in particular Thomas Jefferson, and how Cyrus's edict of freedom was adopted and entered into the US Constitution's Bill of Rights, in particular as the Establishment Clause, or freedom of religion. And lastly, we will review the facts about Jewish interaction with Iran and Cyrus the Great, in particular, Jewish heritage and identity, especially with regards to moral and messianic Judaism, out of which emerged Christianity. So with that, please let's go to the next slide. And the next, please. So Cyrus the Great, who lived from about 600 BC to 530 BC, was the founder of the Iranian state. He was also Messiah to the Jews, as we see in the next few slides. Please. But first, I'd like to quote Arnold Toynbee, who is the historian laureate of Britain, with his world-famous study of history, which some of you are familiar with, as to the relevance and necessity of Cyrus the Great to our very time, to our very era, in that he says, the first Iranian empire was the world's sole superpower during the period of its existence, and its posthumous effect on human affairs has been lasting. Its experience is therefore a matter of topical interest to mankind at the present day. And there wasn't room there to include more of what he says, and what he is saying is to avoid mutual assured destruction and nuclear annihilation, the peoples of the world will have to unite with each other in some manner, shape, or form for the benefit of all. And this falls upon the statesman, and the statesman will need guidance from previous empires. And this they will find in the experience of the first Iranian empire, founded by Cyrus the Great. Next, please. When we go to the Bible, the greatest prophet of the Bible since ancient times, continuously to the present, is the second Isaiah, also called Deutero-Isaiah. And in Isaiah 45, we find that Cyrus is addressed as Mashiach. Now, Mashiach, it means Messiah, because the Greeks and Romans generally did not use the sound sh, and converted the sh to just s. So the Mashiach of Hebrew became Messiah. So the original Hebrew of that would read, thus saith Yahweh to his Mashiach, Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. And in English translation of King James Version of the Bible and most others, it's been translated as anointed. So please, to the next slide. David Ben-Gurion, the principal founder of the modern state of Israel, says, quote, "A special privilege this, to be accorded to a ruler who was not a Jew, and to close the book of books. No other foreign ruler was given such praise, and that by one of the grandest of the prophets of Israel. Beyond question, Cyrus was deserving of these eulogies, and not only because of his proclamation and of his permitting the Babylonian exiles to return to their country and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus was a great figure, one of the greatest from the point of view of general history. And what he refers to, and that's end of quote, what David Ben-Gurion refers to as the special privilege, he is talking about the ending of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, which ends with 2 Chronicles, which at the end states Cyrus to the Jews, who among you is ready to go back to your homeland? And thereafter, the Jews, of course, were not immediately ready because it had been turned into a wasteland. So they stayed with Iran for decades, and Iran financed and enabled the restoration of nationhood to the Jews by rebuilding Jerusalem and by providing military protection when the locals opposed it. So that when they opposed it, as you go and find in the book of Ezra, the Jews who had gone from Iran to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the city would say that it's the king of Persia who has commanded us to rebuild the temple. Next slide, please. Now, Cyrus the Great was not only the savior of the Jews, he was savior of all the captives in the countries that he conquered. And he was therefore the founder and ruler of the world's first and largest multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious unity of states. I'd like to say unity of states because the word empire has connotations of exploitation, whereas his aim was to conquer these countries, to stop them from destroying each other, stop them from fighting each other. His ultimate aim was to ensure the civic and civil life of the people so that a family, a mother and father can raise their children, can have access to healthcare, education, and can make a living and can live in peace with others. And so, as David Ben-Gurion says later in his article on Cyrus the Great, that Cyrus concentrated military and political power in his own hands and left the entire world free to live life as they wish, according to their customs, their traditions, and their preferences. Next slide, please. Yes, the nations that he conquered, especially among the Greeks, they regarded him as father, regarded Cyrus as father, as we will see when we quote from Xenophon. Next slide, please. So Cyrus, Darius, and the other Persians are attested and extolled in the twin pillars of Western civilization, being the Judeo-Christian and the Greco-Roman. Next, please. Yep. Persians happen to be the only people who are praised in the Bible, as biblical scholars tell us. Robert Ernest Hume tells us that in the next slide. Next slide, please. So Reverend Hume of Union Theological Seminary in New York notes how the Persians are the only individuals of other religions who not only are not condemned in the Bible but who receive a distinct commendation. The Zoroastrian king Cyrus is addressed by Jehovah as his Messiah. Cyrus is also referred to by Jehovah with another important title, my shepherd, which in another book of the Old Testament is used with reference to the Lord God himself. Next slide, please. One of the unique aspects of the Persian Empire compared to all the empires that preceded and succeeded it is that it was not built by slave labor. That would have run contrary to all the principles of Cyrus the Great and Zoroastrianism, which holds that it is the human being who can embody the Holy Spirit. And when you enslave a human being, you are essentially penning God. Therefore, there are a huge number of tablets that remain from the building of monuments in the Persian Empire that are kept at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago under the supervision of Matt Stolper, a friend of mine, whereby they state how the laborers got paid, how women rose to positions of authority. Can we go to the next slide, please? And how women received maternity pay for 1 year. And Xenophon, the Greek historian, classmate of Plato, and both of them being disciples of Socrates, writes this in his biography of Cyrus. And remember, the Greeks at that time were the enemies of Iran, the national enemies of Iran, but of course they admired Iran. So he writes that towards him, meaning towards Cyrus, the disposition of all men was such that every nation felt they had failed unless they could send Cyrus the treasures of their land. And all they asked was to be guided by his judgment and his alone. And this, he says, Xenophon, after going through a large number of nations and tribes that Cyrus conquered, at the end of which says the number is so many that it defies the memory of the chronicler, and how all these people could not speak his language and certainly could not speak each other's language, nor even set their eyes upon him. And yet all they asked was to be guided by his judgment and his alone, which, as you can tell, that fits the definition of Messiah that you saw in Isaiah. Next slide, please. And as noted by Reverend Bill Donahue, Persians are the only individuals with historicity in the Bible, meaning you can find a lot about Persian leaders and Persia in secular writings of the Greeks and the Romans and others, but there's no record of Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Jesus, Mary, Paul, Peter, and others outside of the Bible. There's no literary record. However, that does not, I mean, this is just from the scholarly point of view. The faith, of course, remains in those people. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the Cyrus Cylinder, model copy of which is kept at the entrance to the UN Security Council. Next, please. And these are excerpts from the Cyrus Cylinder, where he is king of the world's four quarters and seed of royalty from of old, because Cyrus's father was a king of Iran, of Persia, I should say, and his mother was the daughter of a king of Media. And you may remember the phrase from the Bible, the laws of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. And those were the two nations that comprised the lineage of Cyrus the Great. And so in the Cyrus Cylinder, in this first declaration of human rights, he says, I sought the safety of the city of Babylon and all its sanctuaries. As for the population of Babylon, I soothed their weariness. I freed them from their bonds. And elsewhere he says he freed them from their yoke. I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. And this has been interpreted to include the Jews. Now, at that time, the Jews were not yet called Jews. As we will see, the Persian province of Yahud formed afterwards, and the Persians began to call the inhabitants of that province as Yahudis, from which derives the word Jew in Western languages. Next slide, please. And now we come to the major source for the founding fathers on Iran, being Xenophon, student of Socrates and the elder classmate of Plato, who wrote the Cyropedia, and sometimes I may pronounce it the original Chiropedia. As Arnold Toynbee, again, of Oxford University and University of London says, the Greek accounts are the most copious, and their testimony to the virtues of empire is particularly convincing because the Greeks were hostile witnesses. Xenophon was at the head of a mercenary army of about 10,000 in the employ of a Persian prince. And he recorded the route that he took to Iran and the military hardware and military methods and exercises of Iran. And all of this became the blueprint for Alexander later to follow. So Alexander followed the same route and used all of Xenophon's knowledge, experience, and intuition to turn it now against Iran about 40 years after Xenophon. Next slide, please. Now, this Chiropedia or Cyropedia does have, again, just like Cyrus himself, a relevance to our very present day. It is the world's manual of leadership. It has been the world's manual of leadership since ancient times. Peter Drucker, who is regarded as the father of the modern science of management, and who was respected by my own father and his colleagues at Harvard Business School, says, and this is what his biographer says about him, that despite all the books published on leadership by well-known academic researchers and successful CEOs, Drucker never altered his opinion. Xenophon was still the best, meaning Xenophon's Cyropedia, or biography of Cyrus the Great. Next slide, please. So we saw that Yahweh took Cyrus by the hand. In the Cyrus Cylinder, Marduk also takes Cyrus, and they anointed him as the leader. Next, Alexander admired Cyrus. Alexander's military engineer was called young Xenophon for following everything Xenophon had to say about Cyrus. And next, Julius Caesar and the Roman generals read him regularly. One of the scholars at the conference when the Cyrus Cylinder was on a tour in the US, a conference in LA, likened it, the Roman generals, as having the Cyropedia under their pillow, the manual of leadership. Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince and who argued that leaders should be feared, not loved, recommended reading the Cyropedia, even though the Cyropedia argues the opposite of what he is arguing, that a leader should be loved and admired like Cyrus. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were fond of Cyrus, as you will see in their own words. And David Ben-Gurion, we just saw, was praiseful. The Shah of Iran, the late Shah of Iran, claimed the legacy of Cyrus and held a sumptuous celebration of the 2500th anniversary of Cyrus in 1971. Then there was the revolution, and this President Ahmadinejad turns out to be praiseful of Cyrus, despite the fact that all the rest of the mullahs tried to suppress the legacy of Cyrus the Great. The mullahs, the ayatollahs, the whole regime in Iran. It turned out that Ahmadinejad himself, the scholars at the London School of Oriental and African Studies researched and established that he, despite the fact that Ahmadinejad took a strong line against Israel, he is himself Jewish. And his aunt has lived in Israel for about 60 years as a citizen and grew her family there. And when you see that David Ben-Gurion praised Cyrus, you wouldn't think that the Nazis would be praiseful of him. And yet you find that that was the case. Of course, this is before the rise of the Nazi regime. Hans Gunther was one of the top scientists of state. And he wrote in 1927 that the religion of Cyrus the Great is important for the understanding of the Nordic spirit. And it is the loftiest religion created by people of Nordic origin. And in qualities such as justice, truthfulness, and righteousness, how the Persians were superior to the Hellenes, because in his book, he was comparing peoples of the various peoples of Indo-European origin, and how it is the highest form of ethics taught to mankind. So we see that humanity converges from different ends of the spectrum. Their very region of convergence is Cyrus the Great. Why? Because of his concern for human life, for civilian life, for freedom, for human rights. Please, next go to the next slide, where George Cockwell of Oxford University says that Julius Caesar showed by a remark about how he wished to die that he too had read what the Romans must have regarded as a handbook for would-be monarchs. And there is recorded by Xenophon a passage from Cyrus the Great about the immortality of the soul when Cyrus is dying about 530 BC, where he says that it is the soul that gives life to the body, and the soul lasts when the body is gone. And I've abbreviated that, but it's a very beautiful passage that you would enjoy reading on your own one day. And later it was plagiarized by Plato in what is one of Western civilization's greatest classics, the Phaedo. The Phaedo being the discourse on the immortality of the soul that Plato put together. Next slide, please. Yes, here, Neil McGregor, director of the British Museum, will talk about the book Xenophon and the making of America. Let me say that in this presentation, I want to also pay tribute to all the great scholars. And Neil MacGregor has done the most to bring the message of Cyrus the Great to the world in our time, along with his stellar team at the British Museum and his counterpart, Julian Raby, director at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., who heads the Sackler and Frye galleries, which are the ancient history part of the Smithsonian. And in addition to them, the work done by Scott Harrop of Monticello, Caroline Winterer of Stanford University, and perhaps before all that, I should mention a friend of Richard Frye and mine that first recognized that there were 2 copies of Jefferson's Cyropedia in his collection at the Library of Congress. And that is Cyrus Carr, who did that around 2007 or so in trying to make a documentary for Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus Carr is a filmmaker in Los Angeles, and his firm is called Spenta Productions. And Spenta as in Spenta Manu, which is the Zoroastrian equivalent of the Holy Spirit. And there are other scholars, as comes to mind. We will play their videos here. So please play the video.
Although Cyrus's empire was eventually broken up, the idea of Cyrus himself remained. Cyrus as the model ruler. The principal source for that view of Cyrus came from the Greek historian Xenophon. His book, Cyberpedia, was really about how to run an empire with Cyrus as the model. It was very popular all through the Renaissance, and particularly with the founding fathers of America. And we know that Jefferson had 2, possibly 3 copies of Xenophon's Life of Cyrus and referred to it regularly. So there's a very direct link between the Cyrus Cylinder and the making of the United States.
Yeah. So that was Neil MacGregor, director of the British Museum. Please go to the next slide. Okay, now we come to consider how the founding fathers, in particular Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, but also James Madison, and to some extent Ben Franklin, were inspired by Cyrus the Great and his religion, Zoroastrianism. Next slide, please. So Thomas Jefferson has been called the apostle of Americanism by one of the scholars who was a lifetime scholar, Gilbert Chenard. Next slide, please. And this is perhaps the sweetest of all of these slides that you will see. This is from his granddaughter, Anne Carey Randolph, to dear grandpapa Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson had encouraged his grandchildren to study the Cyropedia. Anne is reporting to dear grandpapa to make him happy that his directives are being implemented, that her brother Jefferson Randolph is now translating the history of Cyrus by Xenophon. Adieu, my dear grandpapa, your affectionate granddaughter, ACR, 1804. That's during Jefferson's presidency, which was from 1801 to 1809. So Jefferson was in Washington and Anne was writing from Virginia. Next slide, please. And in one of his letters to one of his grandchildren, Jefferson says that your Latin and Greek should be kept up assiduously. In Greek, go first through the Cyropedia and then read Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon's Hellenes and Anabasis, Arrian's Alexander, and Plutarch's Lives. By the way, most of those others have a heavy content related to Persia, but Jefferson singles out here the Cyropedia. He prioritizes that. because of the impact that Cyrus's teachings had had on him. Next slide, please. In one of my visits to Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, which has a library and curators, one of the good curators, Miss Andrina Tay, put together this list of Jefferson's several editions of the Cyberpedia. Up to that point, we had thought there was just 2, maybe 3, but then we found out there's 4. Next slide, please. And here, Jefferson is teaching the moral precepts of Cyrus to his grandson, that an ethical man exercises self-control and would not do anything unbecoming, anything shameful, whether in the light of day or in secret. And Jefferson teaches an abbreviated version of that suitable for a young child to his grandson. Next slide, please. Yeah. Julian Raby, brilliant scholar, Oxford scholar, director of the Frere and Sackler Galleries, discovered that Jefferson was going through and comparing his different editions line by line. Can we go to the next slide? The voice, yeah, well, this is Jefferson's a photocopy of Jefferson's, one of his editions of the Cyberpedia, where he has crossed out a couple of lines that Julian Raby will talk about, which I made this photograph in one of my trips to the Library of Congress, and the head of the Rare Books Division, who is also in charge of the Thomas Jefferson collection, Mark Diminution. He's an expert on Thomas Jefferson's bibliography, and he recognized that as being Jefferson's own ink, or rather one of 3 inks that Jefferson uses, he said, which confirms Julian Raby's discovery. Next slide, please. Yeah, play it, please. I hope everybody can turn up the volume to hear Julian Raby.
So in the second room, you will see a copy of Jefferson's Cyropedia. He actually had 2 editions, one from, I can't remember whether it was 1727 or 1737, and the one that you'll see in the exhibition is one from 1767. Now, what's extraordinary is it's open to an opening in which he has scratched out 1 line. He's marked through that line in ink. Now, that particular passage that he has crossed out is a problematic passage in the manuscript tradition and does not appear in, for example, the late 19th century Oxford edition of the Cyropedia. But it's quite clear that Jefferson himself must have been collating line by line between his earlier edition and the later edition. And his earlier edition did not have that particular line. I think that it sounds minimal, but it illustrates the degree of attention that Jefferson himself is paying to the Greek text. And above that copy of the Cyropedia, you will see a quote from a letter that Jefferson wrote to his grandson in 1820, in which he talks about the importance of learning Greek, and he urges him to first read Xenophon's Cyropedia. Now, my recollection of learning Greek was not that this was the ultimate text from a linguistic point of view. So in other words, he's urging him to learn Greek through a book that's a fairly good read, but essentially it's one that has this moral example. Now, I'm sure there are others who would know much more about the broader impact of the image of Cyrus on Jefferson and the other founding fathers. We're looking at a very particular, and I hope telling little example of the degree of attention that he paid to this particular text.
Thank you. For those who did not hear well because the sound quality was low, and our good technician Greg tried hard before this presentation to raise that sound volume, Julian Raby, director of the Sacramento Galleries at the Smithsonian, says how Thomas Jefferson had such keen interest in the Cyberpedia that he was comparing his editions line by line. Next. Yeah, Benjamin Franklin, like Jefferson, was a polymath. And when he was in England, the first translations of the Avesta, or the Holy Scriptures of Zoroastrianism in European languages, had come out in France. So Ben Franklin finds out about it and offers it to the president of Yale University, saying that it contains a nice morality. Next slide, please. John Adams was Harvard graduate and author of the Massachusetts Constitution. He is the one who nominated George Washington to lead the Continental Troops. He's the one who nominated Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. And he was the second president of the US. He had a falling out with Jefferson, and then a good mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, made amendments between them. John Adams wrote in 1763, way before the Declaration of Independence, of his favorite author, that ancient and immortal husbandman, philosopher, politician, and general, Xenophon. Next slide, please. And he had also mentioned Zoroaster in 1776. Next slide, please. And while he was reviewing the first history of Persia that came out in the English language in 2 volumes by British Ambassador Sir John Malcolm, Adams was looking for the ancient parts, and he didn't find it, so he's being a bit facetious here and saying those cunning Edinburgh men break off right at the point of the only subject that excited my curiosity, the ancient modern religion and government of Persia, which again shows the founding fathers' interest in the government of Persia. Of course, there is a reason behind this, and when you go to Plato's Socratic dialogues, in particular Alcibiades I, to find why weren't the founding fathers adopting models from the Greeks and Romans, you will find why, because in there, Plato, in the mouth of Socrates, is comparing for the most handsome bachelor in Athens and nephew of Pericles, who was the leader of Athens at that time, a distant nephew of Pericles, comparing the Greeks and the Persians, and kept saying to Alcibiades, meaning nephew of the leader of Athens, how, quote, how inferior we are to them in many regards, although we excel in educational achievements, we are inferior to them in other respects. So when the founding fathers would read that, well, naturally they would gravitate toward Persia to see what they had. Next, please. Yes, James Madison wrote a treatise on how all the prior forms of government have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. but accepting, of course, from all of that, the government of Cyrus the Great. He also writes to Thomas Jefferson reporting that a person that they both knew had taken up the study of Xenophon. So we know of James Madison's interest in Xenophon. He doesn't say they took up the study of Herodotus or Plato or Thucydides or Plutarch or any of those, but Xenophon. Next, please. Yeah, and this now will show more closely how it entered the Bill of Rights in the US Constitution. Next, please. Yeah, Gilbert Chenard was a lifetime scholar of Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned, and he was a professor at Princeton and Johns Hopkins. And he put together biographies of Jefferson, Apostle of Americanism, and so forth. And now he is talking about the notes that Jefferson took, his commonplace book. Scholars, of course, back then, they didn't have photocopies and cell phones and cameras. So when they read books and reached passages that were important to them, they took down notes. They transcribed those passages. And so this next is a passage that was transcribed by Thomas Jefferson during his formative years, as Chenard says, during his formative years of, say, from 20 to 30. Next, please. Then that ancient religion of the Magi fell, that the conqueror Darius had respected. He never disturbed the religion of conquered peoples. So this is what Jefferson wrote down while reading Voltaire about Iran and the Arab invasion and the forcible conversion of Iran to Islam. So Jefferson was very keen on freedom of religion, which you can see why he made this note. He later wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, but it was difficult to get it passed because there was opposition. So while he was ambassador to France from 1785 to 1789, his friend of 50 years and his neighbor, James Madison, the principal author of the US Constitution, he managed to get that passed through the Virginia legislature with the aid of minority sects, minority Christian sects, as well as Jews. So that then became the cornerstone of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, the freedom of religion. So when we say Jefferson and Madison, they were in Virginia, and Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Today, Virginia is only one of 50 states. But back then, Virginia was a foundation colony, just like Massachusetts, and in some ways more important, from which spawned all the other states. So Jefferson, Washington, Madison, all Virginians, and there were other great Virginians. Next, please. Yes, play the video, please.
This is probably the first moment in history that we know of a ruler thinking about how he's going to manage a multicultural state. The object behind me is known as the Cyrus Cylinder, and it's made of baked clay, and it was buried at the foundation of a building in Babylon about 2,600 years ago, in fact in 539 BC. And what it is a declaration by the king of Persia, Cyrus, who has just conquered Babylon. And he's telling us what he's going to do. Babylon in 539 is ruled by Belshazzar. And Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar, the kings of Babylon, are the kings who had sacked Jerusalem, brought the Jews to Babylon, imprisoned them, brought all kinds of other people to Babylon and imprisoned them. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, is going to set the people free. What he's going to do is allow people to go home and resume their religious life different religions, different people in different places. The Persian Empire is the first empire to have to run in different languages and to accommodate different faiths. So it's always been a point of reference. Cyrus has always been a point of reference to people wondering how you rule a society with different religions, different traditions, without people fighting. So he's very important to us today because all our big cities have people of different religions, different languages. But he's particularly important to the United States because in the 18th century, when the founding fathers are thinking, how will we make a country where different faiths are all respected, but there's no state religion, they look to Cyrus. And Thomas Jefferson studies Cyrus. He tells his grandson to study Cyrus. And the US Constitution is in some ways the direct descendant of this cylinder. I hope that the visitor will, looking at this object, will understand that for any Iranian, this is part of their great history. Just as any Italian knows he's the heir of the Roman Empire, every Iranian knows they are the heir of Cyrus and that great tolerant empire that shaped the Middle East 2,500 years ago, and that the ideas and the ideals of the Persian Empire are very close to the ideals and ideas of the modern United States.
That was again
This is
Neil
probably
McGregor, director of the British Museum. I should say that when the Constitution was first written, it didn't have a Bill of Rights. So at that time, Jefferson had to be our ambassador to France because that was the most important relationship. And so when he found out, he insisted on a Bill of Rights. And that's how this became part of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. So next slide, please. So now we go to, we're kind of running out of time, but we'll go over time because this is important, because Cyrus the Great really should serve as the foundation for peace and understanding between Iran and Israel at the time, at our time, because they both can realize that they can take their heritage back to Cyrus the Great. For the Iranian government, they must realize that the foundation of Iranian government is not Islamic. It is Cyrus the Great, and that's what the people of Iran want. The story of the Jewish queen of Persia, Esther, is just the epitome of many such marriages that occurred after Cyrus freed the Jews. The Iranian tradition of descent, like all the other Indo-Europeans, was patrilineal. The Jewish tradition was matrilineal. So the children on both sides, they were loved and cherished. They were legitimate heirs of both traditions. And they inherited and blended the religious beliefs, cultural norms, and traditions of both parents. So now next we go to Joseph Geyer, founder and director of Jewish Heritage Foundation, who wrote in his book on how the great religions began that the Persians called the people of the kingdom of Judah Yehudis, from which we get the word Jews. The Persians were friendly towards the Jews, and their king Cyrus permitted them to return to their land and rebuild their kingdom. And because the Persians were so friendly, the Jews studied the Persian religion and learned many things from them. One of these was the belief in life after death. A much more important belief that the Jews borrowed from Zoroastrianism was their changed conviction about the coming of the Messiah. From the Persians, the Jews learned that they too awaited a Saoshyant, a redeemer. But the redeemer of the Persians was not to be just a national hero who would bring glory and power to the Persians. Their Saoshyant would redeem all of mankind from the powers of the evil spirit. The Jews too began to think of their Messiah, their redeemer, as more than just a national hero. who would restore the Jewish kingdom in its glory. Next, please. By the time the Jews returned to Palestine and with the help of King Cyrus rebuilt their holy temple in Jerusalem, their religion had greatly changed. A man known as Ezra the scribe began collecting the histories, legends, and laws of the Jews into books. These collected works were called the Book, the Bible, and became the sacred scriptures of Judaism. Please play the next video. This is from Rabbi Mark Gopin, who is professor and director of Center for Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Please play it now.
But Koresh is seen as the model of what is possible in messianic, prophetic leadership of humanity. He is seen as the salvation of humanity, not just the Jewish people. And it is that foundation, if you look carefully in the literature of the book of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is not only important to Judaism, it's critical to Christianity. Because it is the basis for the concept of a Messiah that can redeem history. And redeem history not in some mystical, otherworldly sense. Not nice poetry. Not God bless them, the Jewish mystics or Rumi or others, but this is the idea that God can enter into history and make politics better. Make the relationship between rich and poor better. Make justice a functional part of politics. All of that came from the idea that Koresh actually did it. Not for the Jewish people, but for everyone. The idea, and again, I can't test what's in the cylinder. I studied the cylinder when I was there, and I realized it doesn't say the Jews, and there are some problematic elements, but the biblical literature is unmistakable. That this is an absolute answer to the concept of hope in history. The linearity that there is the possibility of political and prophetic hope that politics can change for the better. That all comes from this non-Jewish king called Cyrus. And that becomes the basis of the Christian concept of Messiah and the Muslim concept of Mahdi in history. If the Jews had not come up with that idea of an ideal Messiah, and then the working of that in Christianity, and then the working of that in Islamic theology. So this is big in Western.
And next, please.
But Koresh.
This is from a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Please play it.
To the Bible, Cyrus issued a decree that appointed and commissioned Jews to go back home, to go and build their temple and to restructure and restart life in their homeland. And according to the Bible, they did, and that ensured Jewish survival. It also created a flowering of Jewish life in the land of Israel, and created a legacy that's important not only to Jews, but also to Christian and Muslims, because it was at that time that the sacred writings of the Jewish people were brought together and edited and revised and shaped to create what we know as the Bible. So one can say that the Bible that we have was decisively shaped in the time of the Persian Empire, under Persian rule, and none of this would have been possible without Cyrus.
And the last video from Rabbi Gopin again, and words that both the leaders of Iran and Israel should heed in making peace with each other. Please go ahead.
Universal human rights is the instantiation of that dream that I believe Cyrus had, and especially as it's instantiated in the biblical books of the Torah. So I want to say also, on that basis, a kind of, there's 25,000 Jews to this day in Iraq. It's the biggest community of Jews in the Middle East that's still there. Whatever regime is in place, no matter how extreme, no matter how strange. No matter how strange a president is. There's 25,000 people there. They haven't been kicked out. And that's very unusual in Jewish history. We're used to moving a lot. Okay, every 100 years in Europe, you had absolutely no right to live anywhere. You were used for usury. You lent and borrowed for the church. And when the peasants got sick and tired of you, the church said you were Satan, and boom, you were kicked out. First England, then France, then Germany. And my ancestors, my name, Gopin, actually comes from England, and then France, and then Germany, and finally Ukraine. And where my grandparents come in Ukraine, there's absolutely nothing left, except a mass grave from the Holocaust. That's it. That's it for Jewish culture. So I want to say to the Iranian people, Mamnun. Thank you. Because despite all of the problematic aspects of Iranian leadership in history, the fact is that there's some remnant that was saved in the cultural pluralism that has allowed for an exceptionalism to this tiny little minority that now happens to have a state and 400 nuclear weapons and has other set of problems, but a people that for 2,000 years have been very, very vulnerable. And it can only come to Mamnun. And the key in our religious literature and wisdom literature is that the key to salvation and transformation of relationship is repentance, apology, forgiveness, and gratitude. These are the major elements of spiritual traditions, which the Iranian state and the Jewish state could use a big dose of. Let's face it, in terms of repentance, apology for the past, forgiveness, and gratitude.
I think that may have been, the last one, and that's the long list of scholars, curators, librarians at presidential libraries and elsewhere who have helped me in this research during my trips to those places that I want to be thanking. I think we've come to the end of it, and we can play the music, I believe. Edgar? Yeah, for further information, you can go to that website, my old professor's website, and you'll find there an article about 45 pages with about 80 references to what we spoke. So the original references are there.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Zand, for that incredibly enlightening presentation. I learned quite a bit about Cyrus the Great and his legacy of human rights, and I'm sure that our audience did too. Now, at this time, before we begin our Q&A, and I just want to remind you all, please post your questions in the chat. We will be playing a musical performance from prodigy Neil Nayar. Now, much of Neil's talents and abilities as a multi-instrumentalist are natural. However, he practices his music 6 hours each day, plays 110 instruments, and is training with 25 musical professionals, both locally and internationally. Neil currently holds the Assist Foundation's world record as the youngest person to play many instruments from all parts of the planet. Today, he will play an instrumental song titled No Boundaries. Thank you, Neil. gosh, Neil, you're so talented. Thank you so much, Neil. Now, we will begin our Q&A session. So if you haven't already, please post those questions in the chat. All right, let's see, Afshin. Your first question is a long one, but I'll go ahead and read it to you. This is from Linda Carter. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. My question relates to slavery. I can see how the founders of the US Constitution adopted the ideas of Cyrus on freedom of religion. They did not, however, follow Cyrus's ideas on paid labor. We know that there were unfortunate compromises on slavery that occurred to get some states to agree to the Constitution. Is there any historical evidence that Jefferson, who we know had slaves, but also was knowledgeable about Cyrus, was personally concerned or influenced by Cyrus's position on slavery? Thank you again.
Well, there is absolutely records left of the earlier drafts of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson had introduced about 80 provisions regarding to abandoning slavery. However, at that time, he was in his 30s and he was an activist. So there were elderly people who had vested interest and they opposed that. Therefore, the Declaration of Independence went through revisions and those parts were removed.
Thank you so much, Afshin. I appreciate it. Let's see. We were also emailed a few questions as well, so I'll go ahead and read one of those. Yeah. If Cyrus were here today, what would he say about the current state of affairs? Our country is so divided, and I'm wondering what advice Cyrus would have to help bridge the divide our nation is facing.
Well, the advice Cyrus would have would be that Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers institutionalized what Cyrus and others in their persons delivered, meaning social justice, meaning they established, the Founding Fathers, they established a system that would largely be independent of the human being and all the temptations that human beings could be given to. So, to answer that question, I would say that we, unfortunately, are not living in the Jeffersonian Republic, the ideal that Thomas Jefferson meant for the United States. We need to go back to his teachings and implement those teachings. Then the United States will be a land of incredible prosperity and freedom for everyone.
Well said, well said. Thank you, Ashin. Another question that was emailed to us is, Rabbi Gopin mentioned in one of the videos that there are problematic elements of the Cyrus cylinder. What are those?
Well, the problematic elements are the fact that the cylinder was damaged. So this is why in the translation you will see broken sentences.
Okay.
That's largely the problems there. And well, the other problem that Rabbi Gopin mentioned was that it doesn't refer to the Jews by name, but that is something that other scholars have also overlooked. And that's the fact that it was after the restoration of nationhood to Israel that the inhabitants of Israel, the followers of what we call now Judaism, were called Jews because they were the inhabitants of the Persian province of Yahud, as Joseph Geyer later explained. So I think that's the major problem that may have been in his mind. And as I say, before the Babylonian exile, they were not called Jews. Afterwards, they were. So we cannot be expecting that it would be stated in the Cyrus cylinder that they were Jews. The other reason is that, of course, there were other tribes and nations held captive that were freed by Cyrus the Great. It wasn't just the Jews, as you heard people say. Yeah.
Alrighty, thank you. Let's see. Another question is, what language was the Cyrus Cylinder written in, and how was it deciphered?
It was written in Babylonian, also called Akkadian, and the decipherment of that goes back to trilingual inscriptions that provided a key. So as you probably have come across manuals of appliances that you buy that are multilingual, and sometimes take an interest in comparing French and German with English. Darius the Great had a meaning successor to Cyrus, who actually carried out the Edict of Cyrus in terms of restoration of nationhood to Israel. He commissioned what is Samuel Noah Kramer calls the greatest inscription in the world, and that is a trilingual inscription on the face of a mountain, and that is in 3 languages. So through first deciphering the Persian, because Persian is an Indo-European language, and it was easy, it was the easiest. Through deciphering the Persian, then they managed to use that as a key to decipher the other languages. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see here. Here's just a short one. Where and when was the Cyrus Cylinder discovered?
It was in the 1870s in what is now Iraq. It was discovered by an expedition of the British Museum, and so it is kept at the British Museum.
Excellent. You said a replica is at the UN headquarters as well?
Exactly, yes. It's been there on permanent display, so that the high representatives of the countries that decide the fate of people remember the Declaration of Human Rights, and they bear in mind the needs of families, of individuals, in making those decisions that they do at the UN Security Council about war and peace.
Excellent. And wasn't there a statue of Cyrus the Great that's being considered to be installed at the UN headquarters? Am I mistaken?
Yes, indeed. A statue was, I should say a sculpture, was designed and built by the architect Zarin Afsar in near Los Angeles, and it was unveiled in November of last year at the Zoroastrian Center. And that statue is being considered for placement at the UN. And it is the statue that appears on the flyer that you sent for this event.
Excellent, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I believe the last question, if no one else has any more, is what books would you recommend for people to learn more about Cyrus the Great and his legacy?
Well, there are a great many books, but I would first and foremost, I would recommend to people to go right to the source that Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others read, and that is the Cyberpedia of Xenophon. Go to the standard translation, which is by Henry Graham Dakins, Dakyns, which is most likely, it will come up when you Google it. University of Adelaide, in their Gutenberg project of the classics, they have it on their website. They have all the classics, or many of the classics, and I would read the Cyberpedia, at least the first few pages and the last few pages as regards the immortality of the soul, which is in the last few pages. To get a broader understanding, go to the website of my old professor, Richard Frye. Click on the first link. It will take you to our article on Thomas Jefferson and Cyrus the Great, which of course includes reference to other founding fathers that we spoke about, and go through that article, and then you will find that at every citation, there's a reference that you can chase, and you'll find plenty of sources to learn more about Cyrus the Great. But as I say, first and foremost, I would read the Cyropedia that Thomas Jefferson had 4 copies of. He actually wrote to his, and this is what Caroline Winter of Stanford University wrote about, that how Thomas Jefferson wrote to his friend Philip Mazzei in Italy asking for an Italian translation of the Cyropedia, because, well, he figured, Italians being, of course, the heirs of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire being the heirs of Greek civilization, would have had insight into the Cyropedia that may be reflected in the Italian translation. So his interest in the Cyropedia was very keen, Thomas Jefferson. Yeah.
Excellent. And I was kidding. I have one more question for you. We'll end it with this one. What is the interest of Zoroastrians in Cyrus? How do they view him?
Well, I mean, Cyrus is the founder of the Iranian state. He is a hero of Zoroastrianism, and he is the principal embodiment of Zoroaster's teachings. Now, a lot of people online may not have heard of Zoroaster. Christians have heard of the 3 magi who came to see Jesus. And as stated in Matthew, those 3 magi were Zoroastrian priests. And as we said, Cyrus was Messiah to the Jews. And as Joseph Gare and so many other scholars have determined since about the middle of the 1800s, there's been many scholars researching the connection between Zoroastrianism and Judeo-Christianity. And so Cyrus is not only important to Zoroastrianism, but he is essential to Judeo-Christianity. He is essentially, rightfully, the founder of moral and messianic Judaism. Reverend Charles Francis Potter, professor at Antioch College, writes in his book about the great religious leaders that Zoroastrianism is the smallest of the world's living religions, yet it lives unrecognized in the churches of its successful rivals and quietly influences their most cherished doctrines. Zoroastrianism is the precursor to Judeo-Christianity. What is moral and the conception of God that prior to the Jewish exile, it was conceived of as that conception of God was one of henotheism and monolatry, but it became monotheism after the Jews inherited through those marriages, the religious beliefs of their fathers.
All right. Excellent. I think we'll end it with that, Afshin. But before we do end this wonderful presentation, I just need a few minutes of everyone's time so I can go over a few announcements. And so, let's see, on March 5th and 6th, our United Nations Association Sacramento COVID-19 Impact Team, which largely consists of food deliveries, will be doing deliveries on Friday and Saturday of next weekend. And we need drivers and volunteers. So if you can help us with these volunteer efforts, please go to unasacramento.org/deliveries. We've been doing deliveries consistently since April of 2020, and we've helped over 400 families and counting. And so we need your help to continue our amazing volunteer work. So that's one announcement. Also, next week, on March 7th, we are having an event with the United Nations Association Davis chapter, as well as the American Association of University Women, the Davis branch. And it's going to be a completely free event with author Barbara Chambliss, who wrote Women Peacemakers, what we can learn from them. And she will be sharing stories of remarkable women who have made the world a better place through their courage and leadership. So stories from Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Middle East. These stories will illustrate the major challenges that these women faced. And so this event is to commemorate International Women's Day. And you can sign up for both of these events at unasacramento.org/events. Our next event on March 11th will be a discussion on discrimination in the healthcare towards Black women in Sacramento. And so we hope that you all can join us for this timely and relevant and stimulating presentation and discussion of the current state of healthcare for African-American women in Sacramento. We will be hearing from leading members of the African-American healthcare community and learn about the disparities in Black women's healthcare. Let's see, next. Yes, also we encourage everyone that wishes to be part of our work to join a UNA Sacramento committee by visiting unasacramento.org/committees. Today's event, for instance, was spearheaded by our Human Rights Committee. And our next event will focus on the Uyghur genocide currently happening in Xinjiang province in China. We feel that not enough people are talking about the immense human rights violations going on in China's concentration camps. And we'll be hosting a future event that educates the public about this ongoing human rights atrocity. And then lastly, if you liked what you saw and heard today, please consider making a donation to fund our work at unasacramento.org/donate. All donations are 100% tax deductible. We are a 501c3, and you will receive a tax receipt as well for your records. Our work is 100% volunteer-based, and we rely on our members and generous donors to fund our work. With that said, we simply just want to thank everyone again, our sponsors. Thank you so much, Mr. Zand, and our amazing musician, Neil Noyar. We've shared a ton of information with everyone today, and I'll be sure to email everybody a summary of the announcements that was shared, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint. With that said, thank you all again for joining us this afternoon, and we wish everyone, all of you all, an excellent rest of your weekend. Thank you, everybody.